Brendan Dassey trial audio of transcripts, day 1, continuing on page 59. The first acceptance of some responsibility for being involved in the case. All right. Then the rest of the interrogation is drawing out as many details as you possibly can. Now, I told you that moving from denials to admissions are unnatural. It's a difficult kind of thing to do, and there's 2 techniques in this case, and you'll see evidence in this case that you'll hear a lot. The first technique is something called expressing superior knowledge. Investigators oftentimes, and if you think about it, they oftentimes express that they know more than they do, that they have more information than they really have. You're going to hear evidence, you're going to hear testimony when officers say things like, "It's all right, we already know what happened," or words to that effect in this case. You're going to hear that over and over and over again. "It's all right, we already know that happened." Excuse me, we already know what happened. Understand that the officers will explain that that is a technique. It is a technique to encourage that unnatural act, to encourage the act of going from a denial to an admission. You'll also hear testimony about how guilty people, that is, people who really do commit crimes, how they hear that very phrase, "It's all right, we already know what happened," how they hear that differently than somebody who's innocent or somebody who may not have committed a crime. All right? So you kind of figure it out yourselves. I mean, jurors, you'll be able to figure this out, and the evidence will help you with that. But guilty people, when they hear "we already know what happened," will tend to make admissions. Innocent people who weren't involved at all, who hear "we already know what happened," will think, "Good, then you're going to know I wasn't involved." And so how it plays on, and you'll need to kind of understand that difference in the dynamic. The last concept that you'll hear about, that I want to talk about in opening statement, is giving a suspect a reason to admit. We talked about that before, is a suggestion that they will feel better, that they will have some moral acceptance, all right? Some real or perceived better feelings about themselves if they get it off their chest. So whether you'll sleep better, or you'll feel better, or you'll get it off your chest, or words to that effect, when you hear that in this case, know, and you'll hear evidence about, that this is a technique, an interrogation technique, and you'll hear a lot about that. Well, there are safeguards, too, that you're going to hear about. We don't just base your case on admissions or confessions of people, but you have to try to verify what it is that somebody says, and this screen explains some of those things that the testimony will show in this case. Can that person's statement be verified, or what's called corroborated, through physical evidence or other known facts? Right? That makes sense. Number 2, were the details not yet known to the public, and more importantly, I'm going to throw in here, were they not yet even known to the law enforcement officers who were asking the question? And number 3, the ability of the suspect to resist false suggestions. Not to resist suggestions, but to resist false suggestions. We'll talk about that when we talk about these March 1 statements. Now, you're going to hear in this case that there was nothing unique about the March 1 interrogation of Brendan Dassey, other than it started off as a witness's statement. Remember, on March 1, Brendan Dassey was still a witness. He was not a suspect at all. He wasn't on the radar screen. All Brendan did at that point, or all the police knew at that point, is that he may have seen some things in a fire of his Uncle Stephen Avery. And you're going to see that entire March 1 statement given by Brendan Dassey. Now, some of it is going to be difficult to watch for a couple of reasons. Number 1, some of it's really boring, but we're going to show you start to finish the entire admission. I think it's about 4 hours long. So as you think later in this week, just prepare yourselves. You're going to have 4 hours of sitting and watching a lot of times not very interesting questions. But let me also warn you, because it's fair to me to do this, that some of the details may be disturbing. They are statements made by a young man who involved himself in some very, very serious behavior, some very serious choices, and you're going to hear how he made those choices and the kinds of things that he and his uncle did to this 25-year-old girl. All right? Now, we have to give you those details. We have to play the entire statement for you. You're the jury in this case. You have to determine whether or not this makes sense, the degree of detail that Brendan gives, the words that Brendan uses, whether or not they ought to be believed. That's your job. Your job at the end of this case will decide whether that statement ought to be believed. I'm going to briefly go through what Brendan Dassey says on March 1, Brendan's version of what happened to Teresa Halbach. Brendan Dassey, in, again, sometimes graphic detail, will talk about approaching Uncle Steve's trailer, and before he even knocks on the door, he hears screaming. He hears screaming from inside of the trailer, and he knocks on the door. Now, remember what I told you about Brendan's statements and should they be believed, and the things that he there and did he help? Remember also, and at the end of my opening, we're going to talk about some choices and the evidence of some choices that Brendan makes. But the choice to knock on the door, even though you hear screaming from a young woman inside, is the first choice that Brendan makes. You're going to hear that Stephen Avery answers the door. You're going to hear that he's sweaty and that he tells Brendan Dassey that he has raped this woman that he has in the back of his bedroom. These are difficult, hard images to kind of wrap your mind around. But this is the version that Brendan Dassey gave on the 31st of October. Brendan actually sees Teresa tied up. He sees her shackled with handcuffs and leg irons to the back bed in the back bedroom. And here, when we talk about decisions, Mr. Avery himself asks Brendan if he wants to have sex with the woman that's been restrained in the bedroom now. Some of the language is very graphic. They don't use the word, "Do you want to have sex?" All right. They use some very, very crude, degrading language towards any woman, but certainly towards a young woman who is in this trailer already. When we talk about those decisions that Brendan gets to make at this point, Brendan says, "Yes, I want to do that." You're going to hear that Brendan Dassey rapes Teresa Halbach. You hear that he walks into the bedroom while Teresa's restrained on the bed, and by force and by violence and with the use and threat of a weapon, he has sexual intercourse with this woman without her consent. You're going to hear a lot more details that I'm not going to share with you at this time about that particular moment, that particular event. I want you to listen to that young man's description of what Teresa Halbach says to him as he's doing that to her. After the rape, Stephen Avery praises his nephew and says, "That's how you do it." These are explanations again from Brendan. The repulsive expression, lack of empathy, lack of any kind of moral fiber, any kind of moral compass at all, for an uncle to tell a nephew, "That's how you do it." Then Stephen and Brendan discuss if they should and how they should kill Teresa Halbach. Again, the decision tree. What does Brendan decide to do? Steve says, "Will you help me?" Brendan says, "Yes." You'll hear testimony about Stephen and Brendan going into the bedroom. Stephen Avery stabs the victim. Brendan Dassey, handed the knife by Uncle Steve, cuts Teresa Halbach's throat. You're going to hear that they take this 25-year-old woman, unclothed, to the garage. They place her on the floor. Dassey waits with Teresa Halbach, who is not yet dead, laying on the floor, as Mr. Avery retrieves his .22 caliber Marlin Glenfield semi-automatic rifle, and Brendan says Uncle Steve shoots her 10 times, at least twice in the head, including on the left side of her head. The statement goes on that Avery and Dassey load Miss Halbach, who's now been killed, thankfully, into the back of her cargo area of her SUV, and they decide how to dispose of her body. Mr. Avery discusses and decides that we should burn the body, should mutilate the body so that it can conceal the crime. Mr. Dassey will tell investigators that he helped carry this unclothed young woman to this large bonfire in the back of Stephen's garage and throws this young girl on the fire. You're going to hear that Mr. Dassey describes burning, mutilating the body to conceal the murder, and taking this very large car seat. Remember, you saw that in earlier pictures. And the two of them threw this car seat onto the fire. By the way, let me just stop here, and as you take notes during this trial, please remember to jot down the kinds of things that require two people. Please remember to jot down where it's a two-man job rather than a one-man job to help you decide, was he there? This is one of those places that requires a two-man job. This large car seat that you'll see, this large metal frame that's thrown on top of this young woman whose body is being mutilated. You're going to hear Brendan tell the officers that the vehicle was driven down to that pit area that we talked about, that it was concealed with branches and a car hood, and the license plates were removed, and Stephen Avery, for some reason, went underneath the hood of Teresa's vehicle. Brendan Dassey will tell you that the garage that thereafter, when they walked back, that the garage was cleaned with bleach, was cleaned with gas, was cleaned with paint thinner, that Mr. Avery took the Toyota key, put it into his bedroom, that Teresa's clothes were thrown onto the fire. There are statements from Brendan. Remember this. Brendan's telling you that her clothes were thrown on the fire, that Avery's finger was cut and actively bleeding at the time, that Teresa's cell phone and camera were burned in the burn barrel earlier that day, and that Stephen's girlfriend, Jody Stachowski, had called Stephen Avery's house at least twice while Brendan was at the house. Those are the statements of an individual. The details of an individual who's committed rape and murder and mutilation. It's your decision, the jury's decision alone, whether or not he was there and whether or not he helped. And when you evaluate Brendan's testimony, you're going to have to come up with those decisions. I can't tell you. There's no expert witness, the judge. Nobody can tell you, but the jury collectively will decide whether to believe Brendan or not. Now, the police officers will provide you with some help to corroborate, to explain the confession, the evidence in this case. You'll have to ask yourself whether the police already know. Even though Mr. Wiegert keeps saying, it's all right, Brendan, we already know, you're going to find out they didn't already know what, and were very, very surprised of what Brendan was telling them, detail after detail after detail. What did they suspect, and what could the police verify? What later could they find by physical evidence to support or to corroborate what it was that Brendan was saying? Later that same day, on March 1, you're going to hear that the officers, they got a search warrant. They said, well, if Brendan says that Teresa was shot in the garage, we better go take a look in that garage. We better take a better look than we took last time. The evidence that will be presented to you that will verify Brendan Dassey's statements, the state believes, will be compelling. The state believes will corroborate or verify what Brendan says. Again, we're not going to ask you to take Brendan's word for it, all of these things, but all of these questions that I'm going to ask you now, and this is the last portion of my opening statement, is meant to explain to you the physical evidence that answers all of these questions. When Brendan says that Teresa was in the trailer on 31st, do we believe that or not? Well, you're going to see evidence that an Auto Trader magazine and the bill of sale, the completion of the transaction, the completion of the photography, and her business with Stephen are found in the trailer, found inside the trailer, verifying what Brendan said. Was Teresa restrained that day, as Brendan says? You're going to hear that both handcuffs and leg irons were found in Stephen Avery's bedroom during the search of his bedroom. The most important question, perhaps, is was she shot in the garage? And that's where the March 1 search warrant becomes so critically important. You're going to see the snow, and the snow is kind of your cue that this is in March rather than the November before. This is Stephen Avery's garage, where they do a much more thorough search of the garage. There are two. These are called evidence tents, by the way, and number 9 and number 23, which is back here, which I'll show you in just a minute, are the important ones. Officers do, in fact, find 2 bullets. Remember, he said that she was shot in the garage. The police on March 1, as a result of Brendan Dassey's statements, after getting the search warrant, find 2 bullets in the garage. One where tent number 9 was shown, it's closer to the front of the garage, and one behind a compressor where tent number 23 is located. This is a better view for you of where those 2 bullets are found in the garage. But the most important finding is number 23. Bullet number 23 isn't just a bullet they find, but Sherry Culhane finds Teresa Halbach's DNA on that bullet. This evidence, this bullet, is proof positive, 100%, something the police didn't know, that Teresa was, in fact, shot in the garage, just like Brendan Dassey told the police. Was she shot 10 times? You're going to hear on the 6th, when they reviewed and they examined and collected evidence, there were 11 separate .22 caliber shell casings that were recovered. Very consistent. Was she shot with this very .22 caliber rifle? Again, of all the rifles in the world, Brendan said it was Uncle Steve's that was hanging on the wall that was used to shoot Teresa. You're going to hear evidence from a man by the name of Bill Newhouse from the crime lab. Mr. Newhouse will take that .22 caliber rifle, you will hear, do some test firings, and will match the .22 caliber bullet that was recovered in this case, as well as all of the shell casings that were recovered. And will tell you that this bullet and these shell casings came from this gun to the exclusion of all other guns on Earth. This gun, not just consistent with, they come from this gun. Was Teresa shot in her head, as Brendan will tell you? You'll hear from our anthropologist, Dr. Leslie Eisenberg, who is the bone expert, who will find a piece of bone that she will describe as a piece of Teresa Halbach's cranium, that is, a skull bone piece, and you'll hear and you'll see that beveling that curve mark there is actually an entrance wound. They even take x-rays of that particular cranial piece, and Ken Olson from the crime lab will tell you that, and perhaps you can see those little white dots that are right next to the entrance wound. Those little white dots, when they're x-rayed, are lead. That's lead from a bullet, all right? So these are bullet entrance wounds to Teresa's head, just like Brendan Dassey told you happened in the garage. Both Dr. Eisenberg and our pathologist, Dr. Jensen, will render the opinion that there are at least 2 gunshot wounds to the head found from these cranial remains, one on the left side of the head, just like Brendan said, and one to the back of the head of Teresa Halbach. Do we believe that Teresa's body was loaded in the rear of the SUV, as Brendan says? Well, you'll see and you'll hear from a blood spatter expert who will talk about the large stains, the blood stains that are left from Teresa Halbach. That's her blood, by the way, and we'll show you some close-ups, unfortunately, of that particular area of the cargo area of Teresa's car, where, just like Brendan tells you, she's loaded in the back of the cargo area of the SUV.